It was a quaint suburban neighborhood, and the house next door had always seemed like any other. It had a white picket fence, well-manicured lawn, and a friendly welcome mat by the front door. But as I would soon discover, appearances could be deceiving. I had moved into my new home only a few weeks earlier, excited about the fresh start and the sense of community the neighborhood promised. My neighbors had been warm and welcoming, except for the occupants of the house next door. From the moment I arrived, I noticed something strange about the neighbors next door. They rarely ventured outside and kept mostly to themselves. Whenever I passed their house, I would catch glimpses of them through the windows, pale, gaunt faces that seemed to peer out from the darkness within. One evening, as I was watching TV in my living room, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the wall that separated our houses. At first, I dismissed it as a random noise, perhaps the sound of the wind against the siding. But the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't ignore it any longer, and I decided to investigate. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the other side, from the house next door. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to knock on their door and ask if they were experiencing any issues. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. A pale, elderly woman stood before me, her eyes sunken and hollow. "I'm sorry to bother you," I began, "but I've been hearing a strange tapping noise coming from your house. Is everything all right?" The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, revealing a row of yellowed, crooked teeth. "Oh, dear," she replied, her voice like a whisper in the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, pulling me into the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and I found myself in a dimly lit, cluttered hallway. Panic surged through me as I tried to break free from her grasp, but she held on tightly, her grip unyielding. She led me deeper into the house, and I noticed the tapping noise had grown louder, now a cacophonous rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls. We entered a room bathed in a sickly green light, and my eyes widened in horror at the sight before me, a row of glass jars lining the shelves, each one containing a beating heart. They pulsed with a faint, eerie light, their rhythms synchronized with the tapping noise. The woman turned to me, her smile widening. "You see," she whispered, "we collect hearts here, hearts that yearn for escape. And now, dear neighbor, your heart will join our collection." With that, she raised a knife and approached me, her eyes gleaming with madness. I struggled to break free, but it was too late. The room closed in around me, and the tapping noise merged with the pounding of my own heart. I had always been a night owl, and my apartment building was usually quiet at night. But there was one neighbor who lived in apartment 302 whose late-night activities had always piqued my curiosity. Mrs. Thornfield, as she was known, was an elderly woman who lived alone in the apartment across the hall from mine. She had lived there for as long as I could remember, and her comings and goings were always a mystery. One night, as I was returning from a late-night grocery run, I noticed Mrs. Thornfield's door was slightly ajar. It was unusual for her, as she was usually meticulous about locking up. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open gently. The apartment was dimly lit, and I could hear faint, murmured voices coming from within. I cautiously stepped inside and followed the sound of the voices. It led me to the bedroom, where I found Mrs. Thornfield kneeling by the bed, her head bowed in prayer. But it wasn't her voice I heard, it was the voices of countless others, whispering and murmuring in a strange, unfamiliar language. I watched in astonishment as Mrs. Thornfield continued her bizarre ritual, oblivious to my presence. The voices grew louder, filling the room with an eerie, otherworldly chant. Suddenly, Mrs. Thornfield's head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto mine. They were a deep, unnatural shade of crimson, and they seemed to pierce into my very soul. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice no longer frail and elderly. "You've seen too much." Before I could react, Mrs. Thornfield lunged at me with an inhuman speed, her fingers like claws. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding her grasp. I fled from the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Mrs. Thornfield's sinister laughter echoing behind me as I made my escape. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Mrs. Thornfield's crimson eyes were always upon me. I knew that I had stumbled upon a dark and malevolent secret, one that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Elm Street had always been a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, but that all changed when the Mays moved into the old, decrepit house at the end of the street. From the moment the Mays arrived, strange things began happening in our neighborhood. The trees on Elm Street seemed to wither and die, and the once bright flowers wilted and turned black. My neighbors and I couldn't help but notice the eerie, flickering lights that emanated from the Murray's house at all hours of the night. It was as if the darkness itself had taken root within those walls. I couldn't ignore my growing unease, and one evening, I decided to pay a visit to the Mays. I approached their front door, my heart pounding, and knocked hesitantly. The door swung open slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and I could hear the faint, haunting strains of music from somewhere within the house. A woman stood before me, her eyes sunken and hollow, her face etched with age beyond her years. She introduced herself as Mrs. Murray, her voice a whisper in the shadows. "I've been expecting you," she said, her lips curling into a sinister smile. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to enter the house. Mrs. Murray led me through a labyrinthine maze of dimly lit corridors and winding staircases. The flickering lights cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, and the music grew louder and more dissonant. We entered a room bathed in a sickly green light, and I recoiled in horror at the sight before me, a collection of life-sized dolls, each one meticulously crafted in the likeness of a neighbor from Elm Street. The dolls were grotesque and nightmarish, their eyes vacant and soulless. Mrs. Murray explained that they were her children, and she had created them in an attempt to capture the essence of our neighborhood. As I looked closer, I realized that each doll had a beating heart, its rhythm synchronized with the haunting music that filled the room. I could hear the faint, desperate whispers of the trapped souls within. "You see," Mrs. Murray whispered, "I wanted to preserve the beauty of Elm Street forever, to capture the essence of its residents. And now, dear neighbor, you will join my collection." With that, she raised a knife and approached me, her eyes gleaming with madness. I tried to escape, but the room closed in around me, and the dissonant music merged with the pounding of my own heart. I had stumbled upon a dark and malevolent secret, a house of horrors that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my days. The Mays had cast a sinister shadow over Elm Street, and I could only pray that I would escape with my life.